Thank you. Welcome back. So glad that you were able to join us this day. They estimate currently there are about 50,000 immigrant churches in the United States. And they are of all sizes. Some are small, some are large. And they belong to all different denominations. And they all speak different languages on Sundays and other days. But you know what is one thing that is common? A significant challenge that all these immigrant churches are facing and are wrestling with is this question. What do we do with the second generation? This growing number of young people in our churches, born and raised in the United States, who are not too comfortable with their ethnic language, would prefer and are preferring English language, who seem to prefer McDonald's hamburger more than their ethnic foods. Or more importantly, those who have different ideas about how to do ministry and begin to challenge the church leadership about the way the church is doing its current ministry. And in most cases, since 1990s, we have been observing that a very large number of second generation would choose to leave their immigrant churches in which they grew up and join what some scholars have called the silent exodus of the second generation. Now, some of these young people don't leave church entirely. They go to other churches. But as you and I know, many of them will simply leave their Christian journey of faith altogether. Today, we have an opportunity to hear a story of one congregation where this silent exodus is addressed and in large is not happening. Where the first and second generation leadership have been working intentionally together last 30 years to do ministry together in spite of language differences, in spite of cultural differences, and in spite of different ways of thinking about ministry. Open Door Presbyterian Church is a Korean-American immigrant church in Herndon, Virginia, which is located right outside of the Washington, D.C. And today, as we hear their story, for those of us who are serving in immigrant churches, I hope and pray that this would not be just an insightful story, but also it would be a hope-giving story. And for those of us who are not serving in an immigrant church, as President and Dr. Tieno have mentioned, it also will be, I believe, a very instructive story, because I don't think it's just immigrant churches that are experiencing the silent exodus of young people. I mean, now there's so much writings being done about religious nones, N-O-N-E-S, those young people who grew up in a church, who are disillusioned with the institutional church. And they would say something like, I want to continue in my spiritual journey, but not in the church. Well, today's story, I think, would also offer many insights of these churches where young people often find not at home. So today, we have two presenters coming to us. These are two pastors who are serving at Open Door Presbyterian Church. Pastor Paul Kim, born and raised in South Korea, and then when he was a teenager, his family moved first to Argentina, South America. And then later, their family immigrated to the United States and settled down in Chicago area. And Pastor Paul first went to University of Illinois to study engineering, and then had God sense a call into ministry, and then came to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School for Master of Divinity program. In fact, he and I were classmates. And then in 1991, God called him to his current congregation, and he went there and served since then as a senior pastor of the Korean-speaking congregation of Open Door. Now, a couple of terminologies you will hear often today. One is KC. When you hear that word, KC, that means Korean-speaking congregation. And then you would hear EC, that means English-speaking congregation within Open Door Church. So I just want you to give a little introduction to those two vocabulary terms that you'll be hearing throughout the day. Pastor Paul has been faithfully serving at that congregation since 1991. Now, Pastor John Cha is a senior pastor of the English congregation of that church. He came to the United States when he was an infant and grew up in the United States, went to University of Virginia, studied there, and then soon after that, he went to Regent College in Vancouver, Canada, and did his theological training there. But we won't hold that against him. Pastor John Cha is actually my brother. And a lot of people think he's my older brother because he has quite a bit of white hair, and he just looked more mature and wiser. But he's actually 12 years younger than I am, and today is actually his birthday. So I'm grateful that on his birthday, he has chosen to travel to be with us, to serve all of us alongside Pastor Paul Kim. So would you now join me in welcoming Pastors Paul and John as they share their stories together.
Good morning, and we are very privileged to be here and very happy to be able to share our story with all of you here at our symposium. As Peter mentioned, my name is John. I am Peter's younger brother. And folks have asked what it's like to be partnering with Peter throughout our journey. And I would have us think back to a movie that you might have seen, any movie where it's a thriller action, where you have scientists trying to figure out some kind of solution to some chemical project, and things are blowing up in the laboratory, and the scientists are all getting hurt. And then you have that scientist behind a bulletproof glass just writing notes and on their clipboard. Well, we're the people in the room where things are blowing up. Peter's the scientist in the back writing, do not do this, and be sure to do this, and then he gets published. So we're the ones who, as we share with you the story of Open Door, the joys, the highs, the lows, the joys and the sufferings of ministry, and we get to share that with you. And we're very privileged to be able to do that. And we hope that you'll see more than the two of us, God at work, God being faithful throughout our journey.
Good morning. My name is Paul Kim. I look younger than John, but I'm actually older than Professor Peter. The secret is you die to live.
You die.
Well, if you didn't catch it, I think you're too young. Me and my wife always joke around, time to die, to live. So that's why I have a black hair. Thank you for inviting us. When I first said yes to this meeting, I was imagining that it's going to be a small gathering. And then I found out it got bigger, and Peter told me that new president's going to be here. And I said, well, you know, I'm not working there, so it really doesn't matter, but it is a lot of pressure for me. Yes, I'm actually serving mainly for Korean-speaking congregation. So if any of you in this room praying for this meeting, and especially for speaker, you know, so that it will be beneficial for you, you can pray hard for me that I don't do lecture or preaching in English. I haven't done it last 20 plus years. So my ministry is mainly all in Korean. So it is a little bit challenging for me to do any presentation in English, so we'll see how it goes. Thanks for inviting us.
So at this time, as we cue the video, one of the things we wanted to do was, before we start talking about the story of Open Door through our presentation, we wanted to actually show you a little bit about Open Door through a video. And please watch the video, and then afterwards we'll begin our talk.
People dreaming of hope in a new land. The ESL program is held every Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Teacher Helen Hong meets with a new student. The culture of immigrants from 30 different countries. We teach with comfortable and warm hearts. There are 4 different level classes, and teachers teach with passion. The ESL teachers are helping the immigrants with a new start in the U.S. Pastor Fahad, who is enrolled in the class, settled in Virginia as a refugee. He served as a pastor of an underground church in Iran and was persecuted by the government. He fled to Turkey, and there he served refugee churches. In 2016, the Open Door short-term mission team met Pastor Fahad at the refugee community, and by the grace of God, he immigrated to Virginia as a refugee.
Every week we come into Open Door Church for ESL, and listening English and learning more better English. I think this class is very good.
A new student comes to the ESL program from Morocco. Mohammed, who was recently dispatched as a journalist to the U.S., came with his wife to register for the ESL class.
Well, my name is Mohammed Sadouni. I'm from Morocco. I have just arrived to the States 2 months ago. My wife will learn English and make it easier for her to live the American dream.
Doha's life in America begins through the ESL class, and we look forward to seeing how her life will change. ODPC supports many missions ministries, but in particular, Muslim, Turkey, and Egypt immigrant and refugee ministries. In addition, God has given us opportunities for local missions in our surrounding neighborhood. This is an American church in Sterling, Virginia, that allows an Arabic church to worship here on Sunday evenings. The church brings together the immigrants and refugees from Egypt. In October 2017, our church connected with their church, and members of ODPC served by providing a children's ministry.
애들한테 니네들 우리 지금까지 그 예배 시간에 어른들 예배할 때 뭐 했냐 물어보니까 nothing, 다 그냥 방치되고 있었다는 그런 말을 들었어요. 이 감당이 안 되는 거야. 진짜 마음이 아프더라고. 그래서 그 앞에서는 계속 찬양 예배를 애들 인도하고 있는데 전 그냥 자꾸 눈물만 나더라고. 울었어요.
Elder Kang Hee Lee's heart towards the Arabic church led to providing a children's ministry. Volunteer teachers are divided into groups: infants, preschool, elementary, and youth, and serve by teaching God's Word. There is joy in expanding God's kingdom by serving local immigrant churches. Grace is shared by sharing the good news with parents. In addition to a children's VBS, we prepared a special program for the mothers. We held a concert. We practiced saying hello in Arabic. Through the concert, we grew closer.
Definition of what a marriage is.
And Susan's Hamonim led seminars on the importance of godly marriage and godly parenting. And during the seminar, we also shared with them the importance of their identity in Christ. We prayed for their problems and asked God to pour out His grace upon them as they learn to live in a foreign culture. Once we opened our eyes to see our neighbors, God provided many opportunities for us to serve. This is where Arab refugees find assistance in transitioning to the U.S.
This place, the Muslim people can feeling it's okay. You can take the families, the Muslim people, to the church direct, because it's hard for these people. And we pray for the place between the church and the Muslim people.
Near the Shalom Center is a church that they borrowed for their Christmas angel tree event. Many Muslim families were invited to a concert, and Santa Claus made an appearance with gifts for the families. Many of the families received the love of Jesus for the first time. To the little ones, to the weak, to those who are hurt, they are near us, yet we failed to see them. Open Door Church is practicing reaching out. Today is the last day of ESL for the spring 2019 semester. Doha came to ESL in fall 2017, where teachers greeted her warmly.
The first time I came into service, it's about resurrection. I didn't know about 3 days. Yeah, but in the service, I heard that. I asked him, and when I came back to my house, me search in internet, what's me?
Yes. We had never known any Korean people. We now know that they are kind and likable. We will never forget you taking us to see the cherry blossom at a beautiful day in DC. Thank you.
This is God who desires all men to be saved and to come to knowledge of the truth. So God wants you to know the truth, right? And He cares for you. So someday, hopefully, you will meet this God, right? So I'm very thankful, and I want to...
Sharing the heart of the Lord with students. Studying and having fellowship together helps deepen relationships. Teachers helping our neighbors take their first steps in faith. They didn't give up on reading the Bible even during Ramadan. Praying that they will meet Jesus Christ as their Savior. Please pray for our ministry to serve our neighbors of other cultures.
That is a video that we showed to present who we are as a church, and hopefully you had a chance to look at the snapshot of our church. At this time, we will go through now the presentation of our church. We wanted to first start, before we say anything, by sharing just very upfront, this is one of many models for immigrant churches. And we are not saying that this is the model, but it is one of many, and it's a model that we were able to thrive and flourish in, as well as wrestle and struggle through. But Pastor Paul and I, we wanted to start with just the very beginning here in 1984, when we started as Korean Orthodox Presbyterian Church. Our church began meeting with 20 Korean immigrant families, and those of us who are part of Immigrant Churches, you're familiar. This is probably the start of your story, meeting in the living room or the basement of someone's house. And the church would be called Korean Orthodox Presbyterian Church to hold up our ethnic and our theological identity, and that is heavy in our name. And this is the starting point for our church.
I started to serve this church in 1991. So actually 1984, when church was planted, I wasn't there. I don't know if you noticed that there was the one preacher fervently sharing the gospel. That's Reverend Cha. Actually, he's the father of the Professor Cha. He planted this church. Since we have many immigrant pastors here, I'd like to share one thing with you is this: our God is much greater than who we think we are. When we started this church, even I got here in 1991, we were always thinking about surviving. We were not sure that we're gonna survive even if 1 year. I still remember that when I first got there, it was the first winter starting, and church was cold. I wasn't familiar with the church building, and I was keep on raising that thermostat, but temperature wasn't going up because they didn't pay for gas. We didn't have gas. That's how we started, and God led us where we are. So God is much greater than, we are believing in great God, so do not limit your God wherever you are. I'd like to truly share the story of God today as we share our congregation story.
So as Pastor Paul mentioned, in 1991, KOPC, we moved to McLean, Virginia, which ironically happens to be the richest county or richest city in Virginia. Millionaires all around us. We had houses around our church building that were bigger than our church building. And so whenever our church had community outreach, yard sales, no one came because compared to what we're selling, people had so many good things. But we found this property, and so we were able to move into a 200-seat church building. And it was just the perfect size for us. And this is where Pastor Paul began his role here as the senior pastor. Now, to share a little bit more about Pastor Paul, and I'll share this on his behalf. He is coming from a very unusual background where he married his wife, Susan. Susan is pure second-gen English speaking. She speaks English. She's a high school teacher, calculus high school teacher in a secondary school. So Pastor Paul has this unique dynamic where at work, in the office, he's speaking only in Korean, and then at home, he's only speaking in English. So there's something God is doing, even through his marriage to Susan. Our EC, we are heavily indebted to Susan. Every time it's her birthday, we go all out to celebrate because she's part of the reason we were able to continue in our journey.
Well, now that our church name is Open Door Presbyterian Church, back then, the name was Korean Orthodox Presbyterian Church. The name itself speaks very loudly that they didn't want change. That's why they named their congregation their name. We want Korean, we weren't Christian, but not every Christian, but we weren't Orthodox Christian. Among them, we weren't Presbyterian. There was a kind of congregation that I got in. And then also I was a very young pastor. I was at early 30 back then, and I didn't have any first generation ministry experience. I served in Chicagoland for about 7.5 years as youth pastor and college pastor. That was all my ministry experience. Then God called me to this congregation. When we moved here, Susan and I, my wife and I, thought that we're gonna just serve 2 years and we're gonna move on. And we just went there to serve 2 years as education pastor and set up some foundation for children's ministry and next generation ministry then. And I promised to my wife that we're not gonna stay here. We're gonna move on. We're actually praying and thinking back then that after 2 years, we're gonna move out to the campus, because I became a Christian while I was in a college. So we were gonna plant the church in college campus, but God had a different plan, and I ended up being there 28 years.
In 1992, Pastor Paul was faced with a decision of the future of the church. Where are we, Korean Orthodox Presbyterian Church, headed? And he started to focus on a model called, which was a new term back in those days, interdependent and intergenerational model. So at this time, KOPC's second generation, the younger generation, English-speaking generation, was now consisting of young adults and mostly college students. And during this time, and part of KOPC's journey through the vision and guidance of Pastor Paul, we would now become two interdependent congregations. Now, what was hard, and this is a challenge, and those of us who are part of an immigrant ministry, you know, that back in those days, especially in the late 80s, early 90s, it was not a popular model to grow with the first generation. When I was graduating from college and friends of mine and I, we were thinking of seminary, afterwards we would talk about, well, what are our plans ultimately? All of my friends said that they would either be independent as a second generation Asian or Korean ministry, or they would join a large Caucasian church and just serve there. None of them said they would go back to their home church and serve with them. And the reason why was because at that time there was so much disunity, that there was so much politics as well as history, bad history of the second generation leaving the first generation on bad terms, unhealthy dynamics that was taking place. And so they did not want to go back there. So for me to say, I do want to go back to our home church. I was a minority, and that was part of our story.
I know we have many pastors here. As you serve a local congregation, we all experience the dark moment, going through the deep valleys of your ministry. The vision for this church now came out of that time. While I was serving there, one of my assistant pastor, who's a dear brother from the college and also went to same seminary, came join me. And then later on, I found out that he lost hope and vision for what we are doing together. So without sharing with me, he was actually planning to split the congregation with the English congregation members. And I found out that, and then I have to go through the soul searching time for myself. Why should I serve first generation congregation? And also there were, we also as a couple going through some difficult time. It was a very difficult time for my wife because, don't speak Korean and serving in Korean congregation is hard. It's going through deep depression, and we have to really find the reason, the biblical reason, God's purpose for us that why should we stay here? And it was a hard time financially. I mean, it's not a good news, but financial part never get better after 20-some years. But I'm so grateful. God sent many godly people and encouraged me and shared that God's greater plan. One of them was a professor from the Trinity, late Ted Ward professor. And he challenged me to think about, instead of just doing the daily ministry, he challenged me to think, what is the purpose of the church? What is the purpose of the Immigrant Church? We're just busy surviving, but go back to that and think about that. And then the one key word that he gave to me was a mission, world mission. Basically church exists for world mission. And then he told me that your daily experience of conflict with language and culture is what you are training for world mission. So that really enlightened me. And then also, while I was trained here, back then we had old professors who have background from the Swedish background. They shared with me that because we emphasized too much on the language and culture, that's why we lost a lot of the young generation. I remember when I was serving in Chicagoland, 80s, 90s, there were Lutheran churches still back then that were preaching in Germany. And so they were sharing that there will be always conflict between gospel and culture. If you put too much emphasis on the culture and language, then you're going to lose next generation. So out of that, through the prayer, the vision of the ODPC came out.
So as Pastor Paul shared, we had to really be able to articulate, be able to find and articulate our vision and the heart behind our interdependent, intergenerational church. A heart for missions, Pastor Paul will share, and then a heart to live out the gospel life together. I'll share that part.
The key verse that I found from the Bible, as you do the ministry, we have to be careful that we do because it works. Pragmatism. And it doesn't fly long. So I have to go back to the Bible, really search the reason for building ethnic church, and then I found the reason from the book of Acts, verse 1:8. It's a very well-known verse. We all know that you will receive the Holy Spirit. As Holy Spirit comes on you, then you will be my witness to the Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and to the end of the world. Professor Ted Ward shared with me very honestly that in his point of view, one of the reasons why Western world mission failed is because they didn't go through their Judea struggling, their Samaritans struggling. They didn't go through that, but they just went to the third world. And they built little America or little Europe in Africa or Asia. That's why he thought that they failed. And that challenged me greatly. So, if you're a first generation ethnic church pastor, you will come across this question a lot. Your second generation will ask you that, why should we stay with you? And often we hear answers like, well, because we need you. We need a Sunday school teacher for younger generation. That's for yourself. It is a reasonable answer, but it is not reasonable at all for young generation who has to sacrifice themselves to stay with you. The reason is we decide that we're going to stay together because we'll become a church, we'll build the kingdom of God together and doing world mission. That was what it was. So that, I have to be careful that I'm not a theologian. I know there are many theologians here. I'm a practitioner. I call myself that I'm a practitioner of the theology. When you read the book of Acts, especially chapter 1:8, it functions as a lens to see through the book of Acts. That's how that first church in Jerusalem Street became church that used for world mission. Because when you read it carefully, there was a chapter 6 of the book of Acts. There was a conflict between that Hellenistic widows and then also Hebrew widows, and they tried to distribute the food amongst the poor. There was a disagreement and there was a tension because that Hellenistic widows getting enough, but the Hebrew widows getting plenty, but Hellenistic widows not getting enough. There was a conflict. That was just the kind of conflict that we go through. And they went through the conflict. We don't know when Book of Acts was written how long that took for them to overcome the conflict. But that was their Judea and Samaria experience. Then after that, you notice that they prayed over and raised next generation leaders, deacons. Catholic interpretation of that verse is like laity and the clergy division, separation of that. But I see this verse as more likely leadership change from one generation to next generation. Because all those young leadership's names are not typical Hebrew name. They're like Phillips, or all those names has that, just like our children, our second generation children, like John has a name John. He also has a Korean name. As same way that, those leadership later on, that who went to Samaria? Not a Peter. The Philip went there. Because they went through their moment, the Judea and Samaritan moment, they learned the lesson and they went to the Samaria. After that, the door was open to the end of the world. So we, as a congregation, staying together, it's not a paradise. There are a lot of conflict. We have to go through conflict. Through the conflict, we're growing together, but we decide to stay together because God has called us here to do world mission. And that's what is the main reason why we decide to stay together.
So for me, I wanted to share about the second passage you see on the slide there, Ephesians 4:1-3, that of all the times of church history where God would reveal the gospel, especially through Apostle Paul, it would happen in a church where there were Jews and Gentiles. I mean, for us to think about that the time of opportune moment where the gospel would now go forth, it would be in a church setting where there were Jew and Gentile. And in that setting is where the gospel would be continued to be worked out, where people would understand what the implications of the gospel was. And so in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1, Paul says, "As a prisoner for the Lord, then I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you've received." And what is that calling? Well, it's everything that was mentioned in chapters 1, 2, and 3, which is basically the gospel. And especially at the end of 3, where Paul mentions that they are now the people of God. Then he says, "Then I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you've received." And then verse 2 and 3, "Be completely humble and gentle, be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace." And so when Paul says live a life worthy of the calling, he doesn't just start leading into personal devotional life or individual, how you're doing in terms of individual piety. He's talking about corporate life, communal life, the way you treat one another. And so for me as a young pastor, as I was looking at, my friends were asking me, "Why are you staying here with this church?" I said, well, because we're called to live a life worthy of what we receive from Jesus. And this is a life where we are to look at each other. And if you look at verses 2 to 3, it's all relational. It's all relationship. Humble, gentle, patient, bearing with each other, making every effort. And I hope as you hear about our story, we made every effort to keep the unity. And what's been beautiful as we've been continuing our journey is those two passages blend together. Because the way we live a life on mission is the way that we continue with life together. We are witnesses in the way that we love one another. And so it's been beautiful to see both come together.
Probably this is a good place to mention that why Asian church? Why ethnic church? For some of the non-ethnic brothers and sisters here, I still get this question. Why is your congregation predominantly Asian? Honestly, that on a given Sunday, you go everywhere. I don't know why we are the only one who get that answer, that question. You go to white congregation, that's white congregation. You go to African-American congregation, they're predominantly Afro-American. But the difference with us and them is this. Because my children are, 3 of them all born here. And because of our family situation, we don't speak much Korean at home, so they don't speak Korean at all. But my oldest one is a medical doctor, but every day people ask him, where are you from? Because his name is Justin Kim, except the last name doesn't say anything about his ethnicity, but still, they still get that question, where are you from? And I remember that while they're attending college, their church always has international Sunday, and they're always asked them to stand under Korean flag, which they never been yet. That's the kind of experience that we go through. If you're European, after you immigrate here, second and third generation, once you start to lose all that accent in your English, and nobody asks you where you're from. But we have to prepare ourselves that my parents are from somewhere, but I am born here, and this is my country. This is the only language that I speak. But let me tell you that we are not here to build a church for Asians. You later on will see that this experience God uses greatly to reach out to the people who's now coming from all over the world in our neighborhood. Because we go through that ethnic people living experience and God using greatly. And I'm so grateful for that.
So with this, the next slide, in 1995, we continued to grow and stabilize as an interdependent, intergenerational church. Our Korean-speaking congregation at this time has about 500 members. Our EC is meeting across the street at a high school auditorium. We have about 150 members and growing families. Now, at this time, the EC, we wanted to we're kind of going through our teenage years, kind of wanting our own identity, so we gave ourselves the name Cornerstone Ministry of KOPC. And actually the space was really helpful for us to just grow with some distance with the Korean-speaking side. But we'll come back to that because later on we'll come back together. And one of the things that Pastor Paul shared about wanting to make missions at the centerpiece of life together started happening in 1998. In 98 was when I came on board as the next English-speaking congregation pastor. And as I came on board, the previous pastor, the former pastor, was called to the mission field. So we sent him out as I came in. And KOPC began forging its intergenerational ties through missions. The EC and KC together, we sent out and supported 2 of our families to Central Asia. We're now in our 20th year of supporting one of the families there. We support the families through prayer, finances, creating joint support teams. So our support teams are from the KC side as well as the EC side. Visiting both families together, joint elder care teams, joint short-term teams, joint long-term members that we send for a year to support them. And we just are starting to find ourselves bound together through missions. And real quick, this is our EC, KC, and youth group creating intergenerational short-term mission teams to serve together on the field. This is a medical trip that we sent to the Gambia. And this first trip, we had 25 KC members, 20 EC members, and 20 youth group members. And this was our first team. Pastor Paul was on that team. We stacked it with some of our best, influential, just experienced seasoned leaders. We wanted this trip to go well, and they had a great time. I believe Pastor Paul gave a impromptu dating seminar till about 4 a.m. in the morning because all the guys in the room just wanted to know just advice on dating. And it was a wonderful time of bringing together as well as serving together. And they all said, hands down, this was the best trip that they ever had. They had never seen or regarded one another outside of their culture. Just a quick story, the Korean-speaking congregation, for those of us who are familiar with Korean congregations, there's honorific titles that you give to people. You do not call them by their first name. You call them by them being the honorable elder or honorable elderly sister, and on and on. The Korean side recognized this. They knew it was a barrier, so they gave themselves English names for this trip. They renamed themselves. And we realized it was a kind of a fantasy come true for them because they always wanted these English names, but never could. So there were guys on the team named Charlton, like Charlton Heston. There was some women named Vivian and Sophia and stuff. And what was cool is when they came back, they were still calling each other by those names. And they wanted to really break down that distance between them and the EC.
Well, the 2 slides we just show you, sending off the missionary or intergenerational, intercultural mission team, it's nothing special. I know every other congregation does that. But this is our effort of loving each other and practice love amongst us. As the Lord said, if we don't love each other, how can we go out and share the love of Christ to the people? And the Lord said that when you love each other, then people will know that you are the disciple of me. And this is one of the thing we do, living out that Christian life through the mission but I think that sharing the meaning of what you do as functional activity of the ministry is so important. Because I noticed that these days, what changed in the church, local churches, the olden days, whenever I go visit, it was like most of the church has that title on somewhere, disciple-making church. Did you notice that these days when you go, they all took that down? Everywhere that I go these days is missional church. But what I am afraid of is this, it becomes just a fashionable statement, but are we really living out that? 30 years ago, nobody used the word missional. But basically, what we dreamed of and then tried to live out was congregation become missional in daily life. And, as some of the head pastor, I think my experience is that our role is help people to see big picture in God's kingdom is so important.
As we continue with our story, in 2001 was a crucial watershed moment when we decided to purchase a 16-acre property. And this is the property you saw in the video. And we moved into a computer science corporation building together. This was right when the whole bubble bursted with the whole tech side. And so they were selling the building. Now, up until now, our interdependent journey was theoretical. We mostly just talked about it, but we had separate space. We were meeting in a high school. The Korean side was meeting in the church building. But now we would invest financially together, move in together, and basically commit to each other in everyday life. There was no turning back. The Korean-speaking side, they were excited. They were the larger congregation. They knew that this was something through which they could continue to grow. The English-speaking side, we were growing as well, but on our side, we had hesitation or even resistance. There were people who had fears. There were people who had still wounds, baggage from past interactions and experiences with the Korean-speaking congregation. Some of them were just really unrealistic. I think I remember there was one congregational meeting I held with our EC side, and I said, you know, our plans are to move, and one of them, our members raised their hands and they said, you know, Pastor John, I know what's going to happen. We're going to move over there and all the mortgage payments will fall on us, the EC. And I said, that is a strange, tell me, you know, where you're, and after the meeting, I asked that person, where'd you get this? And he said, well, because that's what happened with me and my parents. I bought them the house as they got older, and now I'm paying all the mortgage and all the payments. I said, well, you know, this is not going to happen here at this church. And it hasn't. It hasn't. But it was just interesting how that came into congregational life, part of their own personal experiences. We did move, and unfortunately for the EC side, we had about 17 families who did not continue with us. And these were 17 of our families. They walked with us and journeyed with us. However, they were also the ones who were the most resistant and also vocal about not continuing with this model. But we continued on. And so if you look, this is our first few worship gatherings here at our new building. As Pastor Paul mentioned, or the video showed, we're still in the process of renovating as we're going along. And in 2001, our move to Herndon, although the move tested our faith and giving, we moved in and grew both in size and congregational health. I think everyone was now just excited and on board. Our mission to Herndon, Virginia, which is where we are now, we found ourselves in a neighborhood where 51% of the neighbors are minorities. Majority are Hispanic, then Indian, Vietnamese, African. No Koreans in Herndon, which is ironic because we're Korean Orthodox Presbyterian Church. So we would be challenged now. What does it mean for us to be salt and light in Herndon?
We're running out of time. So let's just move
Okay.
on. Yeah.
So with this, some very big changes. 2001, we're starting to take small steps to love our neighbors. The first thing we did was we changed our name, which is a big deal, and Pastor Paul will elaborate a little bit more on that. Korean Orthodox Presbyterian Church becomes Open Door Presbyterian Church. And what was exciting is this is not the EC's idea, is the Korean side. They decided it makes no sense for us to be in a place like this and still, you know, emphasize being Korean or Orthodox Presbyterian and on and on. And so as they made that decision to move towards Open Door, Cornerstone Ministry, we dropped that name and we just called ourselves Open Door Presbyterian Church, the English-speaking congregation. Our KC, EC, and youth group launched a ministry called MANNA, which is our community care ministry. We blessed the first responders, public servants around us with luncheons and gifts, and we started to make this more of our regular practice. We wanted to be a blessing in our neighborhood. We host annual missions bazaars, which soon become, we call it International Festival, because we wanted to make it much more open to other ethnic groups. So other ethnic groups come and sell and can be a part of that celebration, providing office space for other nonprofit groups.
Briefly, that changing the name from KOPC to ODPC, we asked this question until now: who's gonna miss us after we're gone as a church? We surely don't want our community remembering us as a bunch of Asians gathering on Sunday, and then we don't hardly see them weekday, and then when we are gone, nobody misses us. So we intentionally dropped that Korean, because we don't have to tell them we're Korean. You can tell without. So I convinced my leadership that let's think about future. So don't get the wrong idea. It didn't happen overnight. It took me 8+ years to change this name. So changing the name is not that easy, but it was necessary for us to be gospel community.
So just to highlight that, for a congregation to have developed our identity based off of immigrant experience, to retain your name is a time of remembering what that experience. For the Korean side to drop the Korean it's a big deal. It's like changing your name from Kim to Smith, right? There's something there, and so for us, we really, on the English-speaking side, we just were encouraged, we were blessed that we could continue on in our journey together. So with this, we have, after 17 years of God's leading, we're now growing together in a large office building. We share in our Sundays, we share in our mission. We now share the same name, Open Door. And now God would begin to shape our vision for our future together, a story of one vision. And so at this time, this is where our congregation is, about 17 years later. That's the Korean KC sanctuary, and you have them worshiping there. And then in 2004, our entire church would go through a vision casting process and would commit to adopt one unified single vision for the entire church. And this is where we're going to stop, the need for one vision. And then the next session we'll talk much more in detail about this one vision. We had a need for this one vision. Our interdependent model was functional, it was practical. We shared budget, we shared leadership, we shared resources like church vans, we shared space. But as all the congregations grew in one building, there were more and more skirmishes and small fires to put out. I remember I would reserve a room for our EC leadership to meet. It's a boardroom in the building, and then when we walk in, all the Kwonsanims, all these elderly women on the Korean side took over that room, and I can't kick them out. So I think we were meeting in the parking lot. And so we're thinking, and this was happening more and more, like rooms were being taken, and we'd bring our friends, and they're not Korean, and they're, what's that smell? It's Korean food, and on and on. So we're constantly starting to ask, why are we together? And so we soon lived as roommates. Interdependence was practical, but was there more than to being together? Does our future together stir passion? Are we here together for greater reasons, or are we basically roommates who pay rent together? Can we dream? Does God have a vision for us together? And that's what we'll cover in the next session.